May 14, 1998. A hospital room in Los Angeles where the only music is the steady beep of machines monitoring a heart that had beaten in rhythm with America's pulse for over half a century. No spotlights, no orchestra, no screaming fans outside Paramount Theater. Here in this sterile silence far from the smoky nightclubs and neon-lit stages that had been his kingdom. Francis Albert Sinatra, the voice, the chairman of the board, old Blue Eyes, draws his final breath at 82 years old. The death certificate will read heart attack. The deeper truth cuts through the mythology like a knife through silk. Frank Sinatra died from the thing he had both craved and feared his entire life. The absolute silence that comes when the music finally stops. When the music stops, the silence is louder than any applause. Frank Sinatra, the name that once commanded empires built on cigarette smoke and bourbon, that made presidents seek his approval and criminals beg for his friendship, that turned every room he entered into a stage and every woman who heard him sing into a believer. The kid from Hoboken who became the voice of American longing, who proved that charisma could be more powerful than talent and that vulnerability could be the deadliest weapon in an entertainer's arsenal. As nurses quietly disconnect the equipment that had sustained him through his final months, their movements respectful but routine, like roadies striking a set after the last encore. The entertainment industry that had been transformed by his existence remains largely unaware that its defining voice has been silenced. No radio stations interrupt programming. No casino marquees dim their lights. The man who had taught America how to swing, how to love, how to break hearts and mend them with 3 minutes of perfect melody, had chosen to exit without fanfare. But perhaps this quiet ending was fitting for someone who had always understood that the most powerful performances happen in the space between the notes, in the silence that makes the music possible. To understand how the voice became the most compelling and complicated entertainer of the 20th century, we must journey back to the beginning, to a scrawny kid from Hoboken who learned early that survival meant making people listen, even when you had nothing left to say. Voice versus silence. The power to command attention versus the terror of being forgotten. Born Francis Albert Sinatra on December 12, 1915 in Hoboken, New Jersey to Dolly and Marty Sinatra, Frank entered a world where being heard meant everything and being ignored meant nothing. His mother, Dolly, was a force of nature who ran local politics like her own personal fiefdom. Understanding that in America power came to those who could make the most noise. His father, Marty, was a boxer turned firefighter who taught his son that sometimes you had to fight for respect, but it was better to charm your way to it. The streets of Hoboken were Frank's first classroom in the psychology of power and performance. He watched how his mother controlled neighborhood disputes through a combination of charm and intimidation. How his father commanded respect through quiet competence and strategic friendships. He learned that in his world, loyalty was everything and betrayal was unforgivable, lessons that would guide his relationships for the rest of his life. The voice that would make him famous was already there, but it was raw and untrained, more promise than polish. What made it special wasn't its technical perfection, but its emotional honesty. Frank sang like someone who understood that every song was a conversation between performer and audience, a moment of intimate connection that could transform both singer and listener. The local mob figures who frequented the clubs where Frank performed weren't just criminals to him. They were successful businessmen who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Their attention was flattering and their protection was valuable. But their friendship came with obligations that would follow him for the rest of his career. Performance versus survival. The art of entertaining versus the necessity of staying alive in a world where the wrong song could get you killed. The journey from Hoboken to the Paramount Theater was paved with small-time gigs, broken promises, and the kind of desperate ambition that could either elevate or destroy. Frank's early years as a professional performer were a masterclass in the brutal economics of show business, where talent was just the entry fee and survival required skills that weren't taught in music schools. His time with the Harry James Orchestra, and later with Tommy Dorsey, was both education and imprisonment. Working with these established band leaders taught Frank the technical aspects of professional performance, but it also taught him the limitations of being someone else's employee, even when that someone else was famous and successful. October 12th, 1944, the Paramount Theater, New York City. Frank steps onto the stage, and the sound that erupts is unlike anything in entertainment history. Not just screaming, but a tidal wave of pure hysteria that makes the theater shake. 30,000 bobby-soxers have come to see their idol, and their collective voice is louder than any orchestra. But as Frank grips the microphone and looks out into the darkness beyond the footlights, something flickers across his face. A smile that trembles at the edges, revealing the man behind the myth who understands, even in this moment of triumph, that being loved by millions of strangers is somehow lonelier than being ignored. The bobby-soxer phenomenon wasn't just success. It was a form of mass hysteria that made Frank the first modern celebrity, the first entertainer whose personal life became as important as his professional work. But the price of this adoration was enormous. Frank discovered that being desired by millions of strangers was somehow lonelier than being ignored. The World War II years, when Frank was classified 4F due to a perforated eardrum, created the first major crisis of his career. While other male performers were serving overseas, Frank remained home, becoming the target of criticism from those who questioned his patriotism. The controversy was painful and professionally damaging. But it also taught him that public opinion could turn quickly. Stage versus shadow. The brilliant performer under spotlights versus the frightened man hiding in darkness between shows. The 1950s brought Frank Sinatra to the lowest point of his professional and personal life, a period so dark that it seemed impossible he would ever recover the heights he had once achieved. The bobby-soxer phenomenon had run its course. His recording contract with Columbia had been terminated, and his film career had stalled completely. The crisis came to a head in 1951, a hotel room in New York City. Frank stares at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing a failure where millions once saw a star. The razor blade catches the harsh fluorescent light as he draws it across his wrist, not deep enough to die, but deep enough to feel something other than the numbness that has consumed him. The knock at the door comes just in time. Friends who refuse to let him disappear into the silence he fears more than death itself. When the music stops, the silence is louder than any applause. The relationship with Ava Gardner that began during this period was both salvation and damnation. Ava was everything he thought he wanted. Beautiful, independent, talented, and completely unimpressed by his fame. But she was also everything he couldn't handle, emotionally unavailable, professionally ambitious, and utterly unwilling to subordinate her needs to his career. "You are the only woman I ever loved. Without you, I am nothing," he wrote to her in one of hundreds of desperate letters that revealed the depth of his obsession and the extent of his emotional dependency. Their love affair was conducted in the glare of international publicity, with every fight and reconciliation becoming front-page news. The nadir came when Frank was reduced to playing small clubs for minimal fees, his recording career essentially over and his film career completely stalled. The man who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars per performance was working for a few $100s a night, performing for audiences who remembered when he had been famous. But it was during this period of professional exile that Frank began to develop the artistic maturity that would define his greatest work. Stripped of commercial pressures, he began to explore the darker, more complex emotions that his life experiences had taught him. The pain of his failed relationships, the humiliation of his career collapse, and the existential loneliness of his celebrity. all became raw material for a new kind of performance. Ruin versus resurrection. The complete destruction of everything he had built versus the miraculous second chance that seemed impossible until it happened. The role of Maggio in From Here to Eternity came at exactly the moment when Frank needed it most. The part was perfect for him, a tough, vulnerable soldier who understood that survival required both strength and cunning. His performance was a revelation to audiences who had forgotten that he was capable of serious acting. The Academy Awards ceremony. Frank's name is called for Best Supporting Actor. And as he walks to the stage, the entire audience rises in recognition of not just his performance but his resurrection. He grips the golden statue like a lifeline, understanding that this moment represents more than professional validation. It's proof that careers can have second acts, that failure doesn't have to be final. The Capitol Records years that followed produced some of the greatest popular music ever recorded. Working with arrangers like Nelson Riddle, Frank developed a new approach to popular song that treated each performance as a complete artistic statement. The albums from this period, In the Wee Small Hours, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Only the Lonely, were unified artistic visions that explored specific emotional territories with unprecedented depth. The voice that emerged from this period was completely different from the one that had made teenage girls swoon in the 1940s. It was deeper, richer, more emotionally complex. The voice of someone who had experienced genuine loss and discovered that pain could be transformed into beauty. The formation of the Rat Pack with Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop created a new kind of entertainment phenomenon. But the Rat Pack was also a refuge for Frank, a group of friends who understood the pressures of fame and could provide the kind of support that was impossible to find elsewhere. Blue Capitol Studio versus Black FBI Files, Rat Pack laughter versus sleeping pill bottles, showroom applause versus slot machine background music as he walks through empty casinos at dawn, power versus isolation, the ability to command respect and fear, versus the inability to trust anyone or find genuine human connection. The relationship with John F. Kennedy that developed during the late 1950s was both the pinnacle of Frank's cultural influence and the beginning of another devastating personal betrayal. Frank's support for Kennedy's presidential campaign gave him access to political power that no entertainer had ever possessed. The backyard of Frank's Palm Springs compound. The landing strip he had built specifically for presidential visits sits empty as a convoy of black cars turns around and drives away. Kennedy, warned about Frank's mob connections, has chosen to stay with Bing Crosby instead. Frank stands alone beside the unused landing strip, understanding that friendship in his world was always conditional, always subject to political calculation. When Kennedy distanced himself from Frank due to the singer's alleged mob connections, the betrayal was both personal and professional. Frank had genuinely believed that his friendship with Kennedy was real, that his contributions to the campaign had earned him lasting loyalty. The FBI surveillance that intensified during this period added a paranoid dimension to Frank's already complicated existence. Knowing that his phone calls were being monitored, his associates investigated, and his activities documented created a level of stress that contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior. His recording career during the 1960s continued to produce masterpieces, but they were increasingly dark and introspective, reflecting a man who had achieved everything he thought he wanted but discovered that success couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. The alcohol that had been a social lubricant during his early career became a necessity for managing the pain and disappointment of a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within. The pills that helped him sleep also helped him escape from the reality of an existence that had become a performance even when he was alone. The loneliness that had always been part of Frank's character became more acute as he aged. The 3 a.m. phone calls to friends and acquaintances became legendary, revealing a man who was afraid of silence and solitude, who needed constant human contact to ward off the depression that threatened to overwhelm him when he was alone. Legacy versus mortality. The certainty that his work would outlive him versus the terror of being forgotten as a person, rather than remembered as a symbol. The 1970s and 1980s saw Frank Sinatra evolve from entertainer to institution. The My Way era established him as more than just a singer. He became a symbol of American individualism and determination. But the man behind the symbol was increasingly fragile and isolated. The Las Vegas performances that had once been celebrations became exercises in nostalgia. The Sands Hotel, his final regular venue, became both throne room and prison. On his last night there, Frank grips the microphone and his voice wavers on the opening note before finding its strength again. When the final song ends and the band falls silent, he looks out into the darkness beyond the lights and understands that every performance now is a goodbye. When the music stops, the silence tells the truth. His final years were marked by health problems, failed relationships, and the gradual recognition that his era was ending. The voice remained powerful, but the man behind it grew increasingly frail. The audiences who came to see him understood that they were witnessing something precious and finite. The 3 a.m. phone calls continued, revealing a man who had conquered every stage in America but couldn't conquer the silence of his own thoughts. Friends would answer their phones to hear Frank's voice asking for nothing more than conversation, connection, proof that he wasn't alone in the darkness. When Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, the response revealed the extent to which he had transcended entertainment and become an essential part of American identity. The tributes acknowledged not just a great performer, but a cultural force who had helped define what it meant to be American in the 20th century. The immediate aftermath of Frank's death demonstrated how completely he had woven himself into the fabric of American culture. Radio stations across the country immediately began playing his music, but these weren't just nostalgic tributes. They were acknowledgments that his songs had become part of the national soundtrack, inseparable from major moments in American history. New York, New York had become an unofficial anthem for the city. My Way had become a statement of American individualism, and Fly Me to the Moon had become a statement of American individualism. Moon had literally accompanied American astronauts into space. The funeral arrangements reflected the complexity of Frank's life and relationships. The family wanted privacy, but they also understood that Frank belonged partially to the public. The ceremony at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills was small and personal, attended by family members and close friends who had known him as a person rather than just as a celebrity. But the media attention was enormous, reflecting the public's feeling that they too had lost someone important. The eulogies delivered at the service avoided the typical show business hyperbole and focused instead on Frank's loyalty, his generosity, and his complicated humanity. Dean Martin's son spoke about how Frank had been like a second father to him. Nancy Sinatra Jr. talked about her father's devotion to his children despite the demands of his career. The tributes painted a picture of someone who had been difficult and demanding but also capable of extraordinary kindness and support. The musical legacy Frank left behind was immediately recognized as one of the most significant bodies of popular music ever recorded. The albums from his Capitol and Reprise years were acknowledged as masterpieces that had redefined what popular music could achieve artistically, influencing countless performers and changing the relationship between singer and song. But the cultural impact extended far beyond music. Frank had helped establish Las Vegas as an entertainment capital, had contributed to the integration of American popular culture, and had demonstrated that entertainers could wield genuine political influence. His support for civil rights causes had been ahead of its time, and his willingness to challenge segregation in entertainment venues had helped advance social progress. The business empire he had built was vast and complex, reflecting his understanding that entertainers needed to control their own destinies rather than depend on others for their financial security. Reprise Records, which he had founded in 1960, had given him unprecedented artistic and financial control over his work. His investments in real estate, restaurants, and other ventures had created multiple income streams that provided security but also required constant attention and management. The FBI files that were eventually released revealed the extent of government surveillance that had followed Frank for decades, documenting associations and activities that had made him a person of interest to law enforcement throughout his career. The files provided fascinating insight into the intersection of entertainment, politics, and organized crime during the mid-20th century. But they also revealed the psychological toll of living under constant suspicion. The influence of his vocal style extended far beyond music, affecting how Americans spoke, how they carried themselves, how they understood masculinity and emotional expression. The casual sophistication that Frank embodied became a national ideal, copied by politicians, businessmen, and ordinary citizens who wanted to project the same combination of confidence and vulnerability. His approach to performing had revolutionized popular music by treating songs as complete dramatic presentations rather than just vehicles for displaying vocal technique. The concept albums he had created during his Capitol years established templates for artistic coherence that influenced rock musicians, jazz performers, and other popular artists who understood that albums could be more than just collections of individual songs. The charitable work that had been largely private during his lifetime was revealed after his death to have been extensive and generous. The millions of dollars he had donated to civil rights organizations, children's charities, and disaster relief efforts demonstrated a social conscience that had been overshadowed by his more controversial associations. The Barbara Sinatra Children's Center, established by his final wife, continued his commitment to protecting vulnerable children from abuse and neglect. The relationship between Frank and organized crime figures remained a subject of fascination and controversy long after his death. While no evidence was ever found that he had participated in criminal activities, his friendships with known mobsters created a mythology that became inseparable from his public image, adding an element of danger and rebellion to his legacy that appealed to audiences who saw him as someone who lived by his own rules. The women who had been part of his life each contributed their own perspectives on Frank's character after his death, revealing different aspects of a personality that had been too complex for any one relationship to contain completely. Ava Gardner's posthumously published letters revealed the intensity of their connection and the pain of their separation. Nancy Barbato's dignified silence spoke volumes about her understanding of her role in his life. Mia Farrow's occasional comments revealed both affection and bewilderment at the brief intensity of their marriage. His children's memoirs and interviews provided insight into what it had been like to grow up as Frank Sinatra's offspring, dealing with the privileges and burdens of having a father who belonged as much to the public as to his family. Their stories revealed both the benefits and costs of being connected to someone whose fame had made normal family life nearly impossible. But they also demonstrated the genuine love and loyalty that had held the family together despite the pressures. The posthumous releases and remasters of his music introduced his work to new generations who hadn't experienced his live performances but could appreciate the artistic achievement preserved on recordings. The continuing popularity of his music demonstrated that the emotional truths he had captured transcended the specific cultural moment that had created them, speaking to universal themes of love, loss, loneliness, and hope that remained relevant decades after his death. The Las Vegas venues where he had performed underwent transformations that reflected changing entertainment tastes, but they maintained shrines to his memory that acknowledged his role in creating the city's entertainment culture. The Copa Room at the Sands was eventually demolished, but other venues preserved artifacts and memories of the era when Frank and the Rat Pack had made Vegas the entertainment capital of America. The influence of his style and attitude could be seen in countless performers who came after him, from rock musicians who adopted his casual sophistication to jazz singers who studied his interpretive techniques. But perhaps more importantly, he had proven that popular entertainment could achieve genuine artistic significance without sacrificing commercial appeal, that performers could maintain creative integrity while reaching mass audiences. The technological advances that preserved his performances on film and in high-quality audio recordings ensured that future generations would be able to experience something approaching the impact of his live performances. The visual records of his concerts and television appearances captured not just his vocal technique but also his stage presence, his interaction with audiences, and the charismatic personality that had made him one of the most compelling performers of any era. The academic study of his career and cultural impact continued to evolve long after his death, with scholars examining his contributions to American music, his role in breaking down racial barriers in entertainment, and his influence on concepts of masculinity and celebrity. His life became a case study in the possibilities and limitations of fame, the relationship between art and commerce, and the price of extraordinary achievement in American culture. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Frank Sinatra's legacy was his demonstration that vulnerability could be a form of strength, that admitting weakness could actually make someone more powerful rather than less. The songs that resonated most deeply with audiences were those where he allowed his own pain and uncertainty to show through the polished performance, where the man behind the myth was briefly visible. The recording techniques he pioneered, particularly his use of close microphone positioning to create intimate vocal sounds, influenced generations of performers who understood that technology could be used to enhance rather than diminish human connection. His approach to working with arrangers and musicians established collaborative methods that became standard practice in popular music production. The business practices he developed, particularly his insistence on artistic control and ownership of his master recordings, provided templates for other performers who wanted to maintain creative independence while achieving commercial success. His formation of Reprise Records demonstrated that artists could successfully challenge the traditional power structures of the music industry. The fashion and lifestyle choices he popularized, from the carefully casual elegance of his clothing to the sophisticated hedonism of his social life, created aesthetic templates that continued to influence American culture decades after his death. The Rat Pack look became shorthand for a particular kind of masculine sophistication that combined rebellion with respectability. His influence on the development of Las Vegas as an entertainment destination extended far beyond his own performances, helping to establish the city as a place where rules could be bent and conventional social constraints could be temporarily suspended. The integration of gambling, entertainment, and luxury that characterized Vegas during his era became a model for entertainment destinations around the world. The relationship between art and personal struggle that characterized Frank Sinatra's career raised important questions about the price of creative excellence and the responsibility that society bears for supporting its most talented individuals. His story suggested that the same qualities that enable extraordinary artistic achievement might also make it difficult to find happiness in ordinary life, that the sensitivity required for great art might also create vulnerability to psychological pain. The entertainment industry of Frank's era provided little support for performers struggling with the psychological pressures of fame, addiction, or mental health issues. The expectation was that entertainers should be grateful for their opportunities and maintain positive public attitudes regardless of their private struggles. This cultural attitude made it nearly impossible for Frank to seek help for his depression, anxiety, and substance abuse problems without risking his career and public image. The drinking that had begun as social lubrication during his early career evolved into a complex coping mechanism that served multiple functions in his psychological and social life. Alcohol provided temporary relief from anxiety and depression, but it also became a performance enhancer that helped him access the emotional vulnerability that his best work required. The Rat Pack's celebration of drinking as sophisticated rebellion made it easier for Frank to rationalize his increasing dependence on alcohol as lifestyle choice rather than addiction. The prescription medications that doctors provided to help Frank manage his sleep problems and anxiety created additional dependencies that were poorly understood during his era. The combination of alcohol, sleeping pills, and stimulants that he used to regulate his moods and energy levels was dangerous and largely unmonitored by medical professionals who were more concerned with keeping him functional than keeping him healthy. The isolation that fame created was perhaps the most damaging aspect of Frank's psychological landscape. Despite being surrounded by people who claimed to love and admire him, he often felt profoundly alone and misunderstood. The difficulty of distinguishing between genuine affection and opportunistic attention made it nearly impossible for him to form authentic relationships that could provide emotional support during difficult periods. The 3 a.m. phone calls that became legendary among his friends and associates were symptoms of a deeper problem: Frank's inability to tolerate silence and solitude. The same sensitivity that made him a great interpreter of songs also made him vulnerable to depression and anxiety when he wasn't actively performing or being entertained by others. The constant need for human contact became both lifeline and burden for those in his orbit. The competitive nature of the entertainment industry created additional stress for Frank as he aged and watched younger performers take over the cultural spaces he had once dominated. The transition from being the most important voice in popular music to being a respected elder statesman was difficult for someone whose identity had been built around being at the center of cultural attention. The technological changes that transformed the music industry during Frank's later career created new challenges for performers of his generation. The rise of rock and roll, the emergence of album-oriented radio, and the changing tastes of younger audiences made it difficult for traditional pop singers to maintain their relevance without compromising their artistic integrity. The business pressures that accompanied these cultural shifts forced Frank to make increasingly difficult choices between artistic satisfaction and commercial viability. The temptation to pursue easy nostalgia rather than continuing to grow as an artist created internal conflicts that were never fully resolved. The legacy questions that began to preoccupy Frank during his later years reflected his awareness that his time as an active performer was limited and his concern about how he would be remembered. The desire to control his public image and protect his artistic reputation sometimes conflicted with his need to continue earning money and maintaining his lifestyle. The family relationships that might have provided emotional stability and personal fulfillment were complicated by Frank's inability to separate his private life from his public persona. His children grew up feeling like they were competing with his career for his attention, while his wives struggled to maintain relationships with someone who belonged as much to his audience as to them. The charitable work that Frank engaged in throughout his career was both genuine expression of his values and strategic attempt to balance the negative publicity that resulted from his controversial associations. His support for civil rights causes and his generosity toward individuals in need reflected his understanding of social responsibility, but they also served to complicate his public image in ways that sometimes created additional pressure. The questions about authenticity that surrounded Frank's public persona reflected broader cultural anxieties about the relationship between performance and reality in American entertainment. His ability to convey genuine emotion while maintaining obvious artifice in his staging and presentation created philosophical puzzles about the nature of artistic truth that critics and audiences struggled to resolve. In the space between the notes is where Frank lived, simultaneously invincible and fragile, commanding every room while remaining forever alone with his thoughts. So we're left with questions that echo far beyond entertainment. Are you measuring your worth by the applause or by the moments when the room falls silent? At what point does doing your job become losing yourself? If you had a chance at resurrection like Frank's Capitol era, what would you leave behind from your own Columbia period? Frank Sinatra taught America how to sing, but forgot to teach himself how to be quiet. He showed us that between the notes is where music lives, where truth waits, where the real performance begins when all the spotlights fade and you're left alone with who you really are. When the music stops, the silence tells the truth. And maybe that's the most honest song of all.